Hello, my lovelies. My name's Gilbert and the plan for today is to talk about French seams. A French seam is a seam that encases the seam allowance within itself, sealing it away. They're great for sheer fabrics or any other seam that might be visible, but also for children or other people with sensitive skin that might be irritated by a rough seam edge on the inside. On the flip side, they're not great for curves, but can be managed on a very small seam allowance or for heavier fabrics because they do create a bulkier seam. They were developed in the 19th century and in the UK, which leads them to be called English seams in the French-speaking side of the world. For this technique, you don't need anything outside of your usual sewing implements, but do have your scissors and your iron to hand, along with any tailor's hams that you might need. As a comparison, this is a normal seam. It's sewn right side to right side, and on the inside you can see the seam allowance with a raw edge, which can be finished in a number of different ways, but the French seam prevents you from having to finish that edge by finishing it within the seam. So if I was going to make that seam, I would do it like this, with the pins on the inside of the fabric. However, for a French seam, you start by pinning the wrong sides to the wrong sides, so that is with the fashion layer on the outside. This is then sewn in entirely the same way with a running stitch on your machine or by hand. Pressing is always an essential step in your sewing, but on a French seam it's even more essential because the crispness of that seam is going to affect the final look of your product. So once you have your seam sewn, take it over to the ironing board and give it a good press. Now, as a comparison, we have our standard seam on this side with the seam on the inside, and our French seam on this side with the seam on the outside. With your seam pressed, trim down the excess. You want to get this as close to the seam as you can without cutting into it. Then flip your seam back over and pin it with the raw edges inside. Then run your new seam under your machine again on another running stitch. Get it as close to the first seam as you can without trapping any of the excess in the new seam, because if you trap any, it will be visible in the final outside seam. And then of course take your new seam over to your ironing board and give it a good press. As a comparison again, here are the two seams from the outside. They look identical, but as you can see from the inside they look very different. One has raw edges, which will need to be protected in some way, whereas the other one is completely finished and ready to go. And that's your guide to French seams, simple as that. There's two things to be aware of when using this technique. The first is when patterning, it does take more of a seam allowance than a normal seam. So when patterning, if you're making your own pattern, make sure you allow a little bit more than normal. If you're using a commercial pattern, same again, you'll need to add a little bit more onto your pattern. The second thing to be aware of is that that seam is now enclosed and you cannot get to it anymore. So you won't be able to make adjustments to your garment afterwards. This is why historically it wasn't particularly used, because they like to be able to access it for repairs and adjustments as people change size or as it was passed down, etc. So just be aware of that. If you're making something that you think you might need to adjust in the future, this probably isn't the best seam for it. And that is the first entry to the sewing dictionary. Let me know if you liked it, if there's anything you thought I could have covered better, And if there are any topics that you'd like me to cover for next time, please let me know. I'll be trying to be doing this on a bi-weekly basis for the foreseeable future. Can't guarantee what will happen once the world goes back to normal, but for now at least I want to encourage people to get going with something new, so I'm going to be covering a couple of these as a guide for something that you might not have tried before. And that's all. See you again next week. Thanks for watching.